our discussions today, a brief background. As we know, women's representation in African parliaments has seen only slight progress, increasing from 25% in 2021 to 26% in 2024. And we can see this is a very big disparity. Rwanda leads with over 60% female representation, while Nigeria lags at 4%. Botswana has experienced a decline in female representation with only 8.7% of National Assembly seats occupied by women, despite women forming 54% of eligible voters. Namibia, on the other hand, has achieved gender parity in its National Assembly due to political party-driven 50-50 policies. So its upper chambers remain male-dominated. While in Kenya, women hold approximately 23% of National Assembly seats, falling short of the constitutional one-third requirement, which has again hindered by inadequate party support and financial barriers. So these disparities highlight the need for more effective policies to enhance women's political participation. Ms. Juliana, women parliamentary representation has increased from 25 to 26. That is between 2021 to 2024. So what is the current picture of the representation in the best performing and worst performing countries? And maybe you could give us what you think are the reasons for this slow progress.
Thank you very much, Zipporah, for starting the webinar for us. And of course, as you've said, we are having a conversation. And for me, my biggest question is, what is the status of representation in Africa? And we must take note, and we must also appreciate that there has been a gradual, though very slow, progress in terms of having a representation of women in leadership positions and specifically in parliament. And the biggest question why we are having a discussion around parliament is majorly this is the lawmaking body in an organization or in any country. And this is where resources, policies around distribution of resources in a country are made. But the question is, if we do not have a balanced organ where everybody is involved, where everybody's voice is heard, then what is the end result of such systems of such countries without equal representation or even closer to similar percentages? Right now, when you look at the status, Africa has 54 countries, and right now we are looking at Rwanda being the leading country in Africa with around 61.3. It's followed closely by Namibia with 50-50, and actually Namibia elected their president just the other day. And if those who have been very keen around politics in Namibia, you saw the public release of the nominations at the cabinet and at the parliament that they are now proposing, or now they have the 50-50%. Other countries, other top countries in Africa that have made some progress, they are above 40%. We have Senegal with around 41.6. Then we have South Africa that has also made tremendous progress, and Mozambique and Ethiopia. But then we also have a very serious problem with countries that have lagged behind in terms of having women in leadership. And statistics that we have right now, because we are also acknowledging that some countries lack data, we are lacking information. But what we have right now, we are having a country like Nigeria with around 3.6. We have other countries that have less than 10%, like Cape Verde, Eswatini, Botswana. And the biggest question is, what is the comparative analysis around these countries? We should not forget that there are countries like Sudan that have had perennial conflict, that right now they do not even have very strong functional government, even beyond us talking about having women representation. So the question is, why are we seeing this slow progress? Because this is the bottom line. We acknowledge some countries like Rwanda have put in legal and constitutional frameworks that are giving the country an upper hand in terms of having women in leadership. So the challenge that we are seeing in Africa is we are having very weak or slow implementation of gender quotas. And what are gender quotas? These are affirmative policies or legal policies that countries or states have to put in place to ensure that we are seeing representation of special interest groups. And I know different constitutions will define special interest groups from different perspectives, including women, youth, and persons with disabilities. We have different gender quotas that different states will put in place. There are constitutional quotas, and for example, Rwanda has constitutional gender quota that states that not less than 30% of its governance systems, whether it's at the national or whether it's at the local councils, should be representation of the other gender, that is majorly the female gender, should not be less than 30%. And why do we have to continue insisting about gender and talking about women? It's because data shows that historically, women have been the disadvantaged gender, although there are some countries that are the opposite. Right now, Rwanda has 61% of women representation, which means the disadvantaged gender is the male. So with the constitutional quotas, so members in this webinar, you need to ask yourself, do you have constitutional provisions of gender quotas? And if they're not there, it means that that's a very serious challenge about having equal representation in the House. There are also political party quotas, where political parties are obligated or they're expected to have at least a specific percentage of either gender represented in leadership positions. And then there are other specifically reserved positions for having equal representation. That's a major issue that we have in Africa. Countries that have had these quotas or constitutional provisions, then there's also a problem with enforcement and implementation of these gender quotas. There are no specific commitments by governments, by electorates, or even by the leadership of specific states to have these legal provisions followed. The other thing that we are seriously seeing in Africa is the male-dominated party systems, which do not offer equal representation of specifically having the special interest groups represented. We are also having societal norms which disadvantage specific gender, and mostly we've seen women affected by societal norms where women do not have a lot of voice in decision making, even at the family level. And this, of course, translates to decision making level. And we are also having issues to do with limited financing. Ideally, in most countries, women do not have access, control in terms of use of household resources. And this includes land, this includes finances, this includes even decision making. And this translates to having not equal representation in government systems. So we have to continuously ask ourselves, the participants in this webinar, what are our countries or specific states putting in place to address these structural, political, and economic barriers?
Thank you so much, Juliana, giving us a broad perspective and also just being very specific on the key thematic areas on why women, again, we are not able to reach the required balance, inclusivity in our voices within the parliamentary system. So I'll go to the next speaker. I'll ask the question, Emmanuela. Some countries like Rwanda and Namibia have achieved significant progress, while others like Nigeria and Botswana are lagging. I'll be very specific. What explains the stark contrast, especially with Nigeria? Emmanuela?
Very much. Okay, and also thank you, Julian, for the statistics. And so I would actually not have to go back that way. Look, I think one of the major reasons we are where we are today is because we do not have adequate constitutional provision supporting that. Yes, in Nigeria, we have some policies, we have some laws at some state levels that actually promote women's participation in politics or in governance in general. However, we have a constitution in Nigeria that is actually really very vague in addressing the gaps that we are currently facing in Nigeria. So so it's very important for us in Nigeria at the moment, which is something that as women's rights organization, we have been working on for a while. We have had at different levels, even had to amend our demands. We had actually started out with working on the Gender and Equal Opportunities Bill, which suffered tremendous setbacks and still suffering, but we are hopeful that in the near future would get it passed. We have also at various times attempted to also amend the constitution to reflect an equitable distribution of seats for both men and women. Currently, currently we are on the 10th assembly. The legislature is on the 10th assembly, and there is a bill before the 10th assembly currently proposing special seats, modeling countries like I think South Africa and other countries that also have special seats in parliament. And well, we are hopeful because at the 9th assembly we did extensive work, but it still failed. And because of Nigeria is a federal system where we have both the upper and the lower house, and then we also have the states. And so decisions from both the upper and the lower house are the concurrent. There must be a concurrence of the decision, and then also there must also be a 2/3 agreement of the concurrence at state level before that can be effectively amended in the constitution. Unfortunately, the concurrence failed at the National Assembly before it even went to the state assemblies at the 9th assembly. We are currently on the 10th assembly, and the pattern is not, well, at the state assembly there seem to be more vibes, positive vibes at the state assembly. However, we need the National Assembly to come with a concurrent agreement on the issue to be able to reflect in the constitution. I think that's on the one hand. And also on the other hand, we have the issue of lack of political will in Nigeria. Then also our geographical divide is also a very huge challenge. The political architecture in Nigeria is woven in such a way that it's very uncomfortable for women to effectively participate in politics in Nigeria and also be able to win elections favorably. I'm sure it's not news that Nigerian politics is heavily funded, is heavily monetized. And of course, we understand that oftentimes women are less economically disadvantaged in this position. Just not so many women are able to play the money politics that happen in Nigeria. Our election is highly politicized, monetized as well. So it's a case of survival of the fittest, a case of those with the highest money bags to be able to throw around. However, if we have the constitution amendment, that's not, we also have, in addition, like I said, we have policies. We have the national gender policy, which has been amended. The previous national gender policy we had provides for 35% affirmative action for women. Sometime in 2021, 2022, Nigerian women went to court to demand compliance with the affirmative action as contained in the national gender policy. And then at the first instance, there was a ruling to the favor of Nigerian women that the affirmative action upholds. But sadly, the Nigerian government are in court appealing the decision. But the outcome of the decision is yet to come out because it's still in court. And because of that, they're actually holding on to the implementation. So that affected the 2023 election. We were hopeful that with the outcome of the court decision, that we'll be able to see more women in parliament in the 2023 general election. However, we saw a decline of women. Currently in the Senate, we have just 3. We have 4 women in the Senate currently, like you said. We have Senator Natasha in the Senate currently. She's been suspended. She's battling for her seat to be reinstated. With her suspension, that brings us back to 3 women in Senate, which is about 3%. We have currently about 15 women in Senate because we lost one of the seats. One of the women she was the, I think, chief whip until her demise in January. So with her demise, her seat has been replaced. but she's not being replaced with a woman. She's being replaced with a man. So we have lost that seat. So we have currently about 14 women at the House of Reps. And then across the different states, across the 36 states in Nigeria, we have out of about 990 seats, we have about 54 seats, women occupying 54 seats out of 990. That brings us to about 4% or thereabout. So you can see the figures are really very small. And also to say that currently in Nigeria, out of the 36 states, 14 states in Nigeria do not have one woman in the State House of Assembly. They do not have any woman. So we only have about 21 states with women at different levels, maybe one woman in some spaces. Just about 2 or 3 states have more than one woman in the state assembly. And so all of this, it's also, just to re-emphasize my point, is that it's because we do not have an appropriate constitutional provision supporting women participation in politics, in governance, and in all stratas and the economy of the country. And also the national gender policy we have is also not being implemented, is not upheld in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emmanuela, for giving us the perspective. And it's very clear that there is no adequate constitutional policies in place for us to have more women in Nigeria, also the lack of political goodwill and also the political environment. So those are key takeaways for that. So I'll go to thematic questions, which we are going to look at structural and institutional barriers, where I will ask Lucas Nowicki. The political parties play a crucial role in shaping elections outcomes. Would you give us an idea of how women representation, I'd be very specific to South Africa for you, and how can parties be held accountable for increasing female representation?
Thank you so much for the question. I'm gonna just start by also just providing a quick snapshot of South Africa, and then I'll kind of get to the question more broadly. And then also just to speak to the issue of women's representation. I mean, as the previous speakers have mentioned, it's crucial for ensuring that women's voices and experiences are heard in the legislative process. And also what has been mentioned is South Africa has been internationally recognized for having a high percentage of women represented in parliament and politics more broadly. However, there has actually been quite a steep decline in the most recent elections and parliament, moving from 44% in the previous parliament to around 36% in the current parliament. And this decrease is linked basically the two parties that received a large portion of the vote, the African National Congress and the Economic Freedom Fighters. Both these parties implemented internal gender quotas. And as their support has declined in the kind of broader electorate, then obviously this has impacted the representation of women in parliament more broadly. But there is still a high, like in the National Council of Provinces, women make up 55% currently. And in terms of committees, chairpersons, which is an important role for guiding agendas, oversight, and legislation, 5 out of 10 chairpersons of select committees are women, and 14 out of 30 of portfolio committee chairpersons are also women in the National Assembly. And as also in terms of speakers, South Africa has a long history of I think all but one, I think 13 out of 14 speakers have been women. So I think that it's an important legacy to recognize, but then also to recognize now the fact that internal gender quotas within parties, with those parties losing support, we have seen the impact on broader representation. So I guess that speaks to either a renewed call for advocacy towards political parties or instituting some form of more institutionalized quotas. But then to speak more broadly on how on change and how we can bring about change, I think obviously political parties are one of the most important vehicles for this change. So, and obviously they rely on the public and the electorate. So I think civil society organizations and the public pressurizing political parties to implement progressive gender quotas and representation of minorities and other important interest groups is is a huge way to get that shift. Through various advocacy campaigns and pressurizing, making sure that it's a hot topic for an election, I think is an important strategy to put pressure and to try reform, especially in the cases where women make up a very, very small majority of parliament. So I think I'm gonna leave it for more broader discussions and themes, but I just wanted to comment on. It's interesting that we in South Africa have had political party quotas, but now we have seen with those parties support declining a slight reduction. It's not dramatic, but I think it's an interesting theme to reflect on. And then also I think the importance of civil society in terms of advocacy and in terms of setting the agenda for elections. I think that should be a focus, and I think the public has a lot of power in how these issues are responded to through political institutions. But I'm gonna be brief there so we can have more time for discussion.
Africa is there's still no inclusivity, especially in the spaces, and being very specific on a lot of advocacy that still needs to be done, and looking at institutionalizing the quota system. So for the next question, still on structural and institutional barriers, I'd go back to Juliana. And I think you'd mentioned this before, that when you're doing the introduction, that many countries, they have constitutional provisions to provide and promote gender equality, yet implementation remains weak. So you gave us some of the key reasons on why the implementations are weak. But now I'd like to go very specific on, are there any specific policies in your country that promote women representation on politics, especially parliament, and what can be done to bridge the gap between policy and practice? So the policies can be in place, but then the practice, as even been mentioned by Emmanuela and Lucas, it's not being done. So what can be done to bridge this gap between policy and practice? Juliana?
Thank you very much, Zipporah, for that. And I think the big question here is what are the constitutional provisions and why are we not getting this correct? And let me give an example of 3 countries that are doing very well. And I think that country will be now our context, Kenya. I'll start with Rwanda. After the genocide, Rwanda came up with the constitutional gender quota, where they said not less than 30% should be the other gender. And this is representation across all leadership positions, even at the lowest level. For Namibia, that recently elected their first female president, and by the way, we only have 2 female presidents in Africa out of the 54 countries, that is Namibia and Tanzania, and we all understand the Tanzanian scenario. Namibia has the zebra system, where if the president is a male, the deputy is a female, or if within a specific political period or electoral period, the president is a male, then the political party suggests that the next leader should be a female. And I think we saw that coming up very strongly. For Kenya, we have a constitutional provision that says not more than 2/3 of either gender should be in leadership position. That's a provision within our constitution, but I'll be speaking into what are the challenges, and maybe we'll be proposing on better ways we can address that. Apart from that, we've seen other affirmative strategies in Kenya, like having a women representation position, and this is what I was calling special selected seats in leadership that states set aside for that, and we've seen that in our National Assembly. Though we should take note that Kenya has 6 elective positions, and we've only seen this affirmative function being given to 1 elective position. But there's another elective position that has also been given the option of nomination. But still, there are gaps around the nomination process that we are experiencing in Kenya. So what is working for Rwanda and what is working for Namibia in terms of these constitutional provisions? 1, there are very strong enforcement laws for this constitutional provision. And what are we seeing? If the constitution says we need to have 30% representation in governance, in parliament, in whatever leadership position. Then there are laws that will protect that, and there are punishments that will come to political parties. You are either denied the position, or you are not given the specific affirmative funds, or at some point you are not given the upper hand in decision making. So this makes political parties comply to this constitutional provision, and it has become very easy and accepted in these countries like Rwanda and Namibia, which are top 2 countries in Africa in terms of women representation. For Kenya, we've seen the not more than 2/3 gender provision that is in our constitution, but we still have a bigger gap in terms of having political will to see the implementation of this constitutional clause. We are also seeing gaps around political parties giving an opportunity to women leaders to vie and the party nomination processes. But we are also seeing the gaps around having resources for women to position themselves adequately. We've had several court petitions which have ruled in favor of having more women who are the most disadvantaged, but these court rulings have not been adhered to or acted upon. So it's more of what is the enforcing policy of these constitutional provisions. The second thing, we are talking about the gender vocal offices that question this representation. For Namibia, we are seeing that the Ministry of Gender is very strong in tracking progress in all leadership positions. We are not talking about political leadership, even in the education sector, in the health sector, board committees, local leadership systems. The Ministry of Gender in Namibia is strongly responsible for that. And they give reports to the president, and the president has to audit. Why is this not happening? You see, in most African countries, the biggest question is, why are we not having women in parliament? Why are we not having women elected as president? But for a country like Namibia, for them, they have gone to the lowest level to question, why are we not seeing women in board committees and other spaces of leadership? For South Africa, we have the Multi-Party Women Caucus, and maybe Lucas can speak into that. He has quite a lot of experience from South Africa. And then for Rwanda, we have the Rwanda Parliament Forum for Women Parliamentarians, where, of course, they track progress, where sometimes the performance of women is also questionable. Then reports have to be provided to ensure that if we have a specific gender in leadership, then what is their performance tracker? The other thing that we are seeing in most African countries, including Kenya, is the gender monitoring mechanisms, and specifically the independent electoral bodies. Rwanda has the gender monitoring office. In Kenya, we have IEBC, which is also mandated to ensure that political parties are there to equal or even to closer representation. But what is the strength? What is the capacity of these monitoring systems or monitoring bodies? Are they well resourced? Are they independent enough, or they're still being controlled by specific population in governance? And then the last question that we have is, what is the role of the private sector and civil society organizations? For Kenya, we have very strong civil society organizations that are out there, but there's still a question of how strong are they to push for accountability to ensure that we have equal representation. We are looking at Namibia having a very strong civil society organization, civil society network that is autonomous, that keeps the government on check. And that's why we've made this progress to where we are 50-50 representation in Namibia. It's important to look at these 4 things. 1, what are the enforcement mechanisms for the constitutional provisions? Otherwise, we'll have very good constitutional policies that are giving gender parity in our leadership positions. But if they are not enforced, then we are not going to get these numbers. The second thing is, what is the role of specific ministries in specific countries in terms of tracking numbers? And like I said, we should not only focus on the top leadership. We should focus on representation from the lowest level, and then strengthening the role of civil society. Right now, we are talking of shrinking funding space, but then does it mean now civil society organizations are going to shy away? Does it mean that civil society organizations are not going to give support to political party candidates, and especially those who are underrepresented? I was asking myself, what is the next direction with this global politics around donor aid? And assuming most of the candidates were relying on this donor aid to prepare themselves for elections, then what is the next move? How are countries prepared for that?
Thank you, Juliana, for giving us country-specific context. Namibia and the work that they've had to do and being very intentional, including women up onto the grassroots levels in different government positions, not only for parliament. So I'll invite Emmanuela to answer this. To what extent do electoral systems, for example, the proportional representation versus majority system, impact women's chances of getting elected? And should more countries consider reforms? Emmanuela?
Thank you very much. Okay, so I think in terms of countries' compliance and relevant agencies' regulatory frameworks, for us in Nigeria, we have what we call the INEC, that's the Independent National Electoral Commission, which is the body responsible for organizing elections and also ensuring that political parties comply with certain rules and regulations, looking into the policies, manifestos, policy documents of political parties, registering political parties and all of that. This regulatory body called INEC are also responsible for organizing general elections across the states. And then we have states INEC, states CX that organize local government elections. So now this is what happens. In Nigeria, taking a practical example of the 2023 general elections, one of the things that the INEC policy says is that, INEC gender policy says is that every political party must field women candidacy. However, if you go back to the database of the INEC, of candidates during election, you will find most major parties that have the high potential probability of securing seats at their states, not having a single woman on the database. Practical example, we have, like, in these 14 states where we do not have a female representation, you would find out at the on the database, on the INEC database, that there is no single woman on the database. So when we talk about compliance, level of compliance of political parties is really very low, very, very low. And then also INEC, they also have weak enforcement mechanisms. They are not able to enforce their own laws as well. They also have the Electoral Act as well, which its enforcement mechanism is really very low. INEC is also not enforcing it very well. So that is on the one hand. On the other hand, we have we have issues of the political parties themselves. We have major parties in Nigeria. Currently, there used to be 2 major parties, but now we have a 3rd party that is actually really coming up. So I make due to say that we have 3 major parties in Nigeria. If you look at the composition of these major parties in Nigeria and also look at the party structure and the leadership structures of these parties in Nigeria, you do not find a woman holding key positions within these party structures. And all of these factors contribute to the low level of representation we have for women in the country. And so all of this contributes, because if a practical example of the ruling party in the country, you cannot find a woman who is either the chairperson of the party, either at any state level or at the federal level, or holding key positions such as the secretary, the vice. You find women rather hold positions such as women leaders. Those are the at best positions you find, or protocol officers. Even protocol, it depends on maybe PRO, even PRO, they don't give a woman the PRO of a party. So all of these factors are part of the things that actually affect female participation in governance. And also, the judiciary has also been very weak at the election tribunal. We've seen a lot of manipulation take place at the election tribunal. We've seen our laws rewritten at the election tribunal, but that's not to say we do not have gains. Yes, we have gains, particularly at the local government structure. We also have a system of governance in Nigeria that says it's a practice that is, or that is it's coded, it's codified in some political parties that there will be twinning. That is to say that when the man is the president, a woman will be the vice president. But we see this play out effectively only at local government levels. So across Nigeria, in various local governments, we find women occupying key positions at local government areas. But however, at state and federal levels, this system is not so practiced, is not complied with. And also, before now, we used to have more women at governance level. That means as either as a deputy governor, or maybe, I think, no, we've not had a female governor. We've had a situation whereby a woman won for her seat as a governor, but the election was upturned, and there was a revote, and at the revote she was voted out. And but we used to have more women during the twinning, when the twinning system was effective and was complied with. We had more women as deputy governors. Right now, we have less women, about less than 5 women as deputy governors in Nigeria. So when we talk about issue of proportional representation, it's not very effective in Nigeria. I think because of the several laws and policies and with the gaps existing in our laws and policies. And so that's what we are also working on to ensure its compliance. That's why I said earlier that we have currently before the National Assembly, we have a bill for reserved seats. We have a bill for proportional affirmative action, requesting affirmative action at a minimum of 20% affirmative action for both appointive appointive positions, yes, in the country at state and federal levels. So we are hopeful that if and when the constitution is amended to reflect this, we would have more women in parliament and in positions, because the issue is not only limited to political structures or parliament in Nigeria. If you look at the executive as well in Nigeria, we have at the federal level ministers, we have about 7 women out of about 60 ministers. And then if you also go to different state houses of assembly, there are state houses of assembly. We have the gender ministry, what several other countries refer to as gender ministry, as the women affairs ministry in Nigeria. There are some states in Nigeria where a man is the commissioner of the women affairs ministry, and that is because they do not have a single woman in cabinet. So proportional representation in Nigeria has not been. There has been a steady decline in that angle in Nigeria. So, but we are hopeful that with our constitution being amended to reflect a constitutional provision, proportional representation, would have more female representation. But aside from Nigeria, in some other climes and in some other jurisdictions outside of Nigeria, proportional representation has actually contributed to improving and increasing the number of women in parliament. However, it's not the situation, it's not the case in Nigeria. It's really a very sad scenario in Nigeria. Though it has worked in other climes, it has failed to work in Nigeria.
Thank you for your insights on Nigerian experience. And moving forward, now that we've already dealt with the key structural and institutional barriers, I think we'll go closely home to look at financial and societal barriers. So for this, I would like to ask the speakers to do 2 minutes each, so that we can also save on time to be able to get responses from some of the participants in the webinar. So for the on the thematic area on financial and societal barriers, Juliana, there's the lack of campaign financing, which remains a significant challenge for women in politics. So what sustainable solutions exist to address this financial gap? So you probably just in 2 minutes, you can be able to tell us this.
Thank you, Zipporah, for that. Campaign financing is a big issue, but there are there are sustainable models that have been tested and proven in different countries. And I want to give examples of around 3 or 4. One is in Mexico. Electoral laws mandate that public funding for political parties must be given if only there is a 50-50 representation of either gender. When we go to Tunisia, actually all the there's a period Tunisia refunded all the campaign resources to political parties that complied to the 50-50% representation. And then for Kenya, of course, we have the Electoral Financing Act, which of course is like obligating political parties to ensure that there is equal representation. Yet we are not yet there. You look at the Emily's list in the US. This is a model whereby the women leaders who want to vie then are registered under the Emily's list, and of course they have their campaign resources pulled in together so that they can build a strong way. We are looking at a scenario with Japan, the win-win scenario. If there are resources, then we are likely going to have 50-50 models of funding, which is something that, if adopted, can work very well. For Cambodia, there is a fund that is specifically provided for women, those who have shown interest in terms of electoral positions. And of course, this is also tied to the performance of this woman candidate once you are given these resources. For Kenya, the models from the government level are not very strong, but for us, speaking from where I work, we run Democracy Trust Fund, which is a model that we are looking at political party candidates building their own resources. Because already the opportunities that have been provided by the government are not adequate enough for women candidates. But ideally, what we are seeing in all this campaign financing in different countries, it comes with a lot of obligations. You cannot be given campaign financing by a government where you are not committed to delivery of your mandate by either the political party or by the people that you are serving. So it comes with a lot of obligation, but I would recommend those who are here, you check out the models in Canada, in Cambodia, in Tunisia, Mexico, the Emily's List, and then Democracy Trust Fund. That is a model we are domesticating at home in Kenya. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana. You've actually kept a 2-minute time, so thank you for that and sharing the model. So I'm hoping we are going to look at the different models that the different organizations and countries use. So for Lucas, social cultural norms are often discourage women from seeking political office. Then how can grassroots movements and civil society and even the media play a role in shifting these norms? I know you had mentioned earlier about this need for the people to be able to push and advocate for inclusivity, especially in parliament. So then what are the key roles? How can the movement, CSOs and media play a role in shifting these norms?
Yeah, I think first it's important to recognize that many of these environments are very patriarchal. So there's a lot of systemic barriers towards contributing into politics. And I think, yeah, we should never isolate parliaments and politics from kind of broader issues facing women in each country and specific context. But I think grassroots movements, they have a big role in changing political culture and education so they can foster dialogue, highlighting women leaders and creating safe spaces, and civil society organizations can advocate for inclusive policies and also provide leadership and training, as we said, where there often isn't funds for that type of work. And in terms of the media, I think the media has a big role in challenging historic stereotypes around women and women's participation in politics, and then also by amplifying women's voices and experiences and promoting political participation as a norm. I think these are really important mechanisms to affect change from outside the kind of political institutions. Because as I mentioned before, political parties, they are beholden to the public. So with enough momentum and kind of movement, these kind of patriarchal political cultures and barriers that hinder women from participating in politics can be slowly removed.
Thank you, Lucas. So a lot of leadership training for the women, amplifying of women voices by the media, and continuous advocacy is something that we can continue to push. Emmanuela, to you, we recognize there's a lot of burden of unpaid care work, especially for women. Like, you have to be able to be everywhere at the same time, but then expected to still participate in politics. Are there any policy interventions that are needed to address these specific issues?
Issues of unpaid care work is an ongoing conversation that Nigeria does not actually have a policy currently. However, we have a campaign financing policy which is not complied with because, of course, politics in Nigeria is really very expensive. We have, at best, we have the National Gender Policy, which actually advocates for increased participation, has a methodology for inclusion of more women in politics. However, compliance level is really very low. We have, we also have gender policies. We have the INEC gender policy that also advocates and should, with the advocacy and with the guidelines on the national gender policy and also the guidelines on the campaign campaign financing in Nigeria. If it actually is supposed to be able to accommodate women across all strata. However, it's actually not being complied with, and campaign financing in Nigeria is a major problem because, first and foremost, the campaign limits, the financing limit that has been set has never been complied with. It has been continuously exceeded. At every election, the bar is increased. If in the 2019 election, just an example, 1 million naira was expended for the general election. By the 2023 election, it had increased to 3 million naira. So the limit for financing for campaign by political parties and the candidates has been continuously exceeded, thereby making it practically impossible for women who are not earning any form of income to be able to participate. And also, the sources of income in Nigeria is also not disclosed, which has also been a perpetual problem. And so currently we do not have those forms of any codified law or policy that is specifically addressing women who are doing unpaid work in the country. And so, but I think it's something that we are working towards, to seeing how our policies, how our laws can be tightened, can be more strengthened to be able to accommodate women across all stratas of the economic divide in the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuela. I agree with the bit of campaign financing, and then how do we finance our campaign so that we give women equal opportunities to be able to compete with a patriarchal system. And so I'll go to the second last thematic area where we are going to talk about successful strategies and lessons from best practices. Again, I would ask the speakers to just go 2 minutes each before now we look at the future outlook and call to action. So for Juliana and Lucas, from statistics and from previous presentation, we've talked about how Namibia has been able to implement 50-50 gender balance in the National Assembly through political party commitments. What specific, I think we would give maybe just 2-3 lessons each from both Lucas and Juliana. What are these lessons that can be learned from this model? And also, can it be applied elsewhere? I'll start with Lucas.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I mentioned previously that it's very effective. There's various ways you can go about it, as we've been talking about it. There's constitutional quotas, and then in South Africa's context, there is kind of political parties gender quotas. So I think the first lesson is they are a first step, but they are effective at achieving broader representation, and that is obviously needed in parliaments and politics. But it also, as I mentioned, it's only the first step, and there needs to be a shift of institutional culture and broader reforms to make sure that it achieves what it is set out to achieve, rather than just itself being a quota. So I think it's a start, and it's an important start for achieving this representation. And as we've seen from places, from contexts that have applied it, it has achieved significant gains in terms of representation, and those should be celebrated. But I think it is only a start, and that we should always look to refine a model into each context and make sure that it speaks to the social, political, and kind of the climate of the context. So I think I'm going to leave it there. But I think yeah, I think that we should always look at making sure we refine each model and apply it to each context to make sure that it realizes as much progressive reforms and then what we want to achieve with it.
Thank you, Lucas. Juliana?
Yeah, thank you, Zipporah. I only have two things. One, when we are looking at the Namibian model, as this would be an easy win for any country in Africa. If political parties or governments agree we are doing 50-50, then this lessens these other economic, social challenges that are affecting specific gender. If we agree we need 50 male, 50 female, then all these other issues can be shelved at some point. We don't need to invest so much resources trying to support women to campaign. We do not need to invest a lot of resources on issues to do with visibility, capacity strengthening, and all that. Because already the political system and the constitutional provisions already are offering a fair ground. The other easy win, which is a model that can work, and it is working in Namibia very well, is the zebra list. If the president is a male, then the deputy should be a female, and vice versa. And this should also appear in all representative positions in whatever space that we are talking about. This also lessens other financial burdens, where people have to find resources to push themselves into these positions. The model with Sweden and New Zealand, one of the things that is working so well is that New Zealand adopted the 50-50 model since the 1990s. It's working, and for them, having issues of equal representation is not even a matter of discussion. There is the issue of voluntary gender quotas, as long as either gender has shown the capacity to deliver in this leadership position. We've seen the model of New Zealand, where having young people in leadership is not even a problem. And we've had a very strong case study of Jacinta Ardern. She joined political, one of the ruling political parties when she was 17, and she became a senior political leader. Maybe we can check out her story. So the issue of if we cannot do the zebra, which I know in Kenya it was proposed at some point, even those who have interacted with the G7 agenda, the conversation is around having the zebra system. If that cannot then work, what is the alternative model? One is having resources that are going to finance one of the disadvantaged gender to campaign adequately, to be in a position to vie on an equal level ground. But where are we going to get these resources? Then it's about, if the government has to give any money to political parties, then there must be commitment to that gender rule or any constitutional provision that is there. The issue that we have with Kenya is enforcement of what we have. The other option, which is also a very longer route, is now women trying to look for resources themselves, positioning themselves adequately, trying to play an equal ground with the other gender, despite all these challenges. But like I said, this is a very long route. So which are the low-hanging fruits that we can tap into?
I'll go to the next key thematic area where we are going to, I'm still going to ask Emmanuela, beyond quotas, what are the practical interventions For example, we're looking at leadership training, mentorship, which have also been mentioned, or even targeted campaign funding, which has been mentioned, have proven effective in boosting women political participation, especially from your own experience within the organizations that you've been working?
Thank you. I think other interventions that we can go with are when we have, like we are currently working on, is working at different state levels at the community area to begin to run a kind of a political school where young women are trained, particularly at the level of aspirants, to become interested, have vested interest. Because one of the things that we realize that there are a lot of women who are members of a political party, but interestingly, they are not card-carrying members of political party, which means that they are not registered members of political parties. Then it means if you are not a registered member of a political party, you would have limited access. So you find out that, so that's one of the things that we have improved on in the country. So if you find 50 women who are members of a political party, 45 out of those 50 women are registered members of the political parties. And also one of the things that we have also been working on to improve is also to catch them young, to begin to talk to young people from tertiary institutions and also from within the communities where we work, to ensure that they become politically aware, they begin to engage in politics at all levels. Because also part of what we have done is not just focusing on the political parties themselves, also from tertiary institutions. We have been able to build capacities of young girls in tertiary institutions who are now running for key positions within the tertiary institutions. There's this thing that we call student union government. Student union government is like a president of the student union in country. And now we are beginning to see women take up positions, become student union government. And that's a step into the broader conversation of women representation, both in governance generally, both in executive and legislative seats. And so to this extent, we have been able to achieve huge success. So these are part of the small other things. They are not really small. Other things, having a girls academy for girls who are interested in politics, having girls at the tertiary level engage in politics at the school level and also within the community. Also, we also realized that politics begins from the grassroots, from the ward level. So we are equipping and also building capacities of women within the communities to engage in grassroots politics, ward level politics, because at various interventions, even those who eventually emerge are oftentimes nominated from the ward level. So we are building capacities of women, encouraging women to be actively involved in politics at the grassroots level. And so these are part, and we are beginning to see huge success. And in no distant time, we are seeing a situation whereby all of this involvement and intervention will begin to metamorphosize into broader things within the national and state levels. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emmanuela, and giving us experiences from Nigeria and your organization. So to the final question on looking at the future and call to action. Emmanuela, just to you back before I go to Lucas and Juliana. If you could implement one immediate policy change to improve women representation in Africa politics, in 1 minute, what would it be?
Sorry, okay, so in Africa, it will be a constitutional amendment to include 50-50 seats for women in governance, both the executive and the legislature. Affirmative action, 50-50 affirmative action.
Thank you, that's so spot on. That's very spot on. Lucas, as we look forward and move forward, looking ahead, so we are looking at 2030, what would be the key priorities for African governments and parliaments and even CSOs to ensure political participation is not just a target, but a reality? So I'd give you 1 minute on this.
1 minute. Okay, well, I think the previous panelist said, I think 50-50 is a huge goal. And we've spoken about the different means that one could get there through various quotas. But I also think incorporating gender mainstreaming into the work of parliament and government, which is integrating gendered perspectives into policies, budgets, programs, and activities, to ensure that women's needs and experiences are considered. And this obviously needs training and resources to implement and establish kind of clear mechanisms for the implementation of gender responsive policies. And I think using both these kind of multi-pronged approaches that could go a long way in creating more gender inclusive governments and parliaments.
Thank you, Lucas. Juliana, on to you. How can young women be encouraged to enter politics, and what support systems need to be in place to sustain their participation? So they are encouraged to enter, but also how do we look at how their sustainability in participation remains?
Thank you, Zipporah. Maybe one of the things we need to take note when we are talking of young women, I think the problem that we are facing in Africa is not only the young women, but I'll come to that. We need to acknowledge the layers of marginalization that women are facing. And when we make reference to special interest groups, the category of women, we are talking of young women, we are talking of women with disabilities, and we are also talking of women from marginalized areas, and also women who are vying for lower levels of leadership in spaces whereby cultures are more entrenched. These are different layers that we need to acknowledge when we are talking of marginalization. But specifically to your question on issues of young women and leadership, I think it starts from the lowest level of education, and I think Emmanuela mentioned it. How is our education system in whatever specific state we are in, whether it's in Africa or in the global north? The question is, how is our education system factoring in leadership skills from the lowest level? We are not making reference on political leadership only. There are other spaces of leadership, the executive, the education, health sector, corporate sector. So how do we start grooming young people from that level? There has been a complaint that so many young women are inexperienced, they lack the capacity to lead, they do not have the zeal, they complain too much. But like, I'll make reference to New Zealand, Jacinta. She joined political party politics when she was 17, and people trusted her. The system trusted her, and she's made serious, tremendous impact in New Zealand. So it's also more of a specific civic education targeting young women who are out of school or those who are in college. We're also looking at establishing specific political programs, young women caucuses in specific countries. But then most importantly is the mentorship programs that we offer to these young women that who aspire. There are experienced women out there, of course, who have the capacity to unhold the young people, but we need to expand these opportunities for them. Thank you, Zipporah. Back to you.
Thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you, Juliana. Thank you to Lucas and Emmanuela on giving us your insights on the key thematic areas on financial societal barriers, on giving us your insights around institutional barriers and around the future outlook, and also successful strategies and lessons on best practices. So I would like to open the floor to questions from anyone who would want to seek clarification or who has a comment, especially a question to the speakers. Maybe they could raise their hands up, then we can be able to take questions in 5 minutes.
There we go. I was unmuted initially, and then I thought there might be background noise here. Just to introduce myself first, my name is Kgotatso Semela. I am the Africa lead for the Open Government Partnership, and I'm so pleased that this session was convened. And so I just want to thank very much the organizers and the moderators and the speakers. I think, it's been really interesting to listen to this conversation. And one of the things that struck me, having worked in this field, not gender specifically, but the governance and politics space for over 20 years now, it just struck me how some of the conversations that we are having now are so similar to what we talked about 10 years ago, you know, in terms of the extent to which legislation is progressive, the extent to which actually, you know, issues like financing for campaigning and actually access and participation in political processes by women. And so with that in mind, I mean, there are two questions that occurred to me, and I would love to hear the reflections of our panelists on them. The one is, do we think there's an opportunity perhaps to look at the kind of role that institutions that are in some countries, they're sometimes called constitutional bodies, like for instance, in South Africa, we have the Commission for Gender Equality. Do we think there's a role that institutions like that could play that could be more proactive in terms of not only tracking the data about levels of participation, but also tracking the responses or the level of the responsible and the responsibility that's being taken to ensure that there is more participation? That's the first question. The second question I have is linked really specifically to political parties, which are really the avenues through which political participation takes place, and often are the spaces where we find a lot of the challenges that women tend to face, you know, to participate effectively. And so one of the questions that I wonder, because there's been a trend of late for institutions like political parties registries to be in place. So for instance, again, in South Africa, there's a requirement for political parties to declare the financing in terms of the income that they receive and where that money is coming from. And so I'm wondering, for instance, is there an opportunity, for instance, to use those kinds of mechanisms? In other words, where we are getting innovations like political parties registries that are requiring a certain level of accountability from political parties, is it possible to think about the kind of advocacy that could be done for them to also focus on this issue of inclusion? For instance, could we have some kind of indicators to say, to what extent is a political party making it easier or more difficult for women to participate, first of all? Secondly, to what extent is there investments being made within political parties for more women's political participation? So models like, for instance, creating space, creating a lower level of catership, or creating levels of catership of women that could then be built into for more senior roles and to advance in the system. Because what we do see, except for those sparks, those like exceptional instances, unless there's a deliberate sort of very conscious effort within the actual political party itself, you will see very limited representation from women, especially younger women. You'll see mostly older women, you know. So is there a way that we could use those instruments, the political parties registry, the instruments that are monitoring where investments or where money is coming from, to also look at what is happening with those monies, what kinds of investments could be made? So it's just something that occurred to me, again, as I said, having been in this space for a long time and just thinking to myself, but we cannot continue having the same conversation. There must be some things, maybe we can think a little bit out of the box, given what has become available through new instruments like political parties registries, like, you know, political parties funding legislation that requires a higher level of transparency. Thank you. I will stop there, Ben. Thank you so much for, again, giving me the space and to ask the questions. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kotatu. While the speakers note that question down, I'd like to take another question from the chat box from Dr. Sarah Kilemi, and she asks, in Kenya, political parties nominate women in order to comply with the gender inclusivity requirements. However, the caliber of those nominated women and their contribution in changing the perception of voters towards women leadership has been disappointing. It would be good to hear how other countries have managed to ensure that affirmative action is positively contributing to wide acceptance of women leadership in Africa. Over to you, Zipporah.
Thank you, Ben. So I will give the panelists to answer the questions before we go to before we go to Dr. Sarah Kilemi. So Juliana, Emmanuela, and Lucas, I'll give you one minute each to answer the questions that came in from Maditizo on key areas, especially what can be done, because she has mentioned that over and over again, we keep on doing the same thing. So what can be done differently?
Okay, I think what can be done, I think I agree that it's pretty obvious that as particularly from the civil society perspective, we do the same things over and over again. One of the same things that we do over and over again that contributes to the decline in the number of female representation in Nigeria is the fact that we we concluded before we started building capacities of women. So I think one of the things that we can do very differently is for us to have like a marathon capacity building process. Like, I had mentioned earlier, there is now what's it called, an academy for young girls to be able to build the capacities of young girls to vie for positions. And so beyond the academy, one of the things we should also be doing is working with women in politics, in politics generally, on a marathon basis without taking a break. Continuous capacity building for women, particularly from the grassroots. And I think that would make a difference. So because one of the things that I have seen is that at the end of an election cycle, there's a break. And maybe 1 year, 2 years into the next election before we begin activities. So if we work and ensure that we do not have these breaks, I think we'll be able to, because one of the things we have also realized is that politics is a school. And so if we keep the women in the school to continue to learn how politics is done, and also consistently amplify and give women visibility. That's something we have not said today. I think also women who are in politics also, maybe they may not be occupying positions, but they are in one political party or the other, either at executive level or the legislative level or judicial level. Amplify the voices and the actions of these women, even little gains, little wins from the grassroots level. Begin to amplify, project, put women on the forefront, let them be on the news, constantly on the news, train women to be able to engage media, to be able to stay consistently in the news, and that will make them relevant. And so when it comes to bringing them into spaces, either in the executive or the legislature, it will be a lot easier. I think if we begin to do more of that, because that's one strategy we have adopted, and I believe that if we begin to do more of that, amplifying women's voices, actions, the work they do at all levels, even at the private space, private sector, public sector, beginning to amplify and showcase women, I think that also would contribute and improve the representation we have currently in country. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuela. Go to Lucas.
I'll just quickly, I mean, I think a lot of it has been touched on, but I think what's happening now is there's a big gap often between theory or policy and practice. And I think we need to try bridge that gap. Like in South Africa, to speak to our own kind of context, you have these kind of very far-reaching piece of legislation, but there's still inadequate resources, lack of awareness, and systematic barriers that hinder full implementation of these kind of laws and policies that are aimed at equalizing politics and access to resources. And I think these reforms and kind of bridging the gap between policy and practice is fundamental to making sure that we don't get stuck kind of at a lag period where things don't feel like they're changing.
Thank you, Lucas. Juliana, would you like to respond to that question?
Yeah, I mean, Zipporah, how do we move from the norm? That is the biggest question. Because when you look at most African countries, yes, the constitutional provisions are there, but what is the issue? Why are we still facing these historical challenges? For me, the biggest issue is the lack of political will. And I think one of the participants mentioned that. When you look at countries like Namibia, it's not that Namibia has done anything so unique. Much of it has been what is the will of the ruling party, that is SWAPO. They say, yes, we want to have on board 50-50 gender representation. But even if we want to have this equal representation, we also want to have quality representation. We want to see how is this going to work for us? Because for Kenya, we have the constitutional provision, not more than 2/3 gender role. Those who are from Kenya in this group, the question is, why are we not having this implemented? It's simple, lack of political will. When we are talking of political parties not complying to the 2/3 gender rule, what would you say would be the reason? Lack of political will. We are told that we need to have the nomination list having a zebra format or zebra system. It's not coming through. The electoral bodies are not responsive to that. Who is going to be the accountable organ? If this system has to go through different hands, and then nobody's questioning that, then the big issue is the political will to ensure that we have accountability, to ensure that we have whatever is provided in whatever electoral law is followed. We are talking of electoral political party financing. There are also constitutional mandates to that. For us to give you this specific amount of money, then we want to see increased representation of women or the SIGs, the special interest populations. But that is not coming through. Dr. Sarah is from Kenya. I'm from Kenya, of course, but I like the model from Rwanda where we are asking ourselves, why are we having political parties nominate just to comply to the constitutional provisions? When you look at the model of Rwanda, there's a tracking matrix that Rwanda has put in place. If we have the 61.3 representation, which is by women, then what is their performance track record? And these women are not brought into these positions because they are women. Then they must meet the constitutional qualification. Unfortunately, for us as a country, we've given room for leadership to lowest level of qualifications, especially the members of county assemblies. If you look at the constitutional requirement for that position, it's very low. And then we have to question their performance when they are brought on board. Then do we blame ourselves or do we blame the constitution? Because this person who is brought into power has adhered to the constitutional provision. Maybe they are representing a specific region or a county, and then they are brought from a different county. By default, they become a minority in that different county they are brought in. So it's about to ask ourselves, what constitutional provisions do we have, and are they serving us? Is it high time we question this and move to better proposals that work for different governments? Zipporah?
Thank you, Juliana. And I think there's a question. I'll take two last questions. There's one question from Dr. Sarah, but then just a follow-up question for Lucas. And she's very specific. So she's asking, should we consider advocacy for political parties to also reflect what supportive measures, for example, financing, is in place to support women to advance in their plans? So I think then the question, now Lucas can be able to answer this before now we go to Dr. Sarah's question.
So I'm not sure if I'm the best person to answer this question, but I do think that, as you said, the political party funding adds a layer of accountability, and I think using this for advocacy is extremely effective, especially if you want to challenge or promote certain kind of issues that are not being dealt with. So I definitely think that they are the kind of access to that type of information. Political parties are obviously the ones that need to change political culture, and I think that having access and using this type of information for advocacy is hugely empowering for civil society, and I do think it's an important method. But I don't think, yeah, I think there could be other people that could clarify or speak a little bit deeper to the issue.
Thank you so much. And I think Dr. Sarah's questions has already been answered by Lucas when she had posted a question, and Lucas was saying that it's important, especially due to political structures, to end up with situation where we have more MPs behold to their political parties than certain constituencies. So, and such mostly does not necessarily translate into positive reforms in policy and institutional culture. So I think Sarah's question was answered by Lucas. So we'll, just so that we don't take so much time because of other engagements, I think we will pick the last person who had their hands raised. Ben, I'm not able to see who on my end. I don't know if you could take it up.
Halep, please go ahead.
Thank you. I really just wanted to riff off the last intervention, which had to do with the lack of political will. And part of what I think is the problem is that political parties are social constructs, right? In the same way as, and so we are essentially asking social gatherings to take on board the country's constitutional values. That's not necessarily what happens. Political parties aren't necessarily bound to the values expressed in the Constitution. So something like gender equality, for example, isn't necessarily part of the values of an individual political party. Forcing that, I'm not sure how you get that. And then you get into all of these situations where women are nominated to fill a quota. You know, because of your gender, we'll push you forward in the line. It's not really about us wanting you to be an effective politician. And so the thing I'm struggling with is that we are reliant on the political will or those in power to give up some of their power. And we know how incredibly difficult that is. So Namibia has made amazing strides, and you know, it's only the third woman president on the African continent. No, fourth. And it took her 60 years of being within SWAPO to get to that point. 60 years, okay? Remember, she was the vice president. And so, yes, there's this 50-50 rule, but every single president before her was a man. In South Africa, we had the rather weird statement by the ANC Women's League a couple of years ago, which said, well, South Africa is not ready for a woman president. So the issue for me also is around promotion of women, etc., is that if even an ANC Women's League, the grouping of women within the ANC doesn't feel that any of them is ready to take on board the leadership of the country, then we're in trouble. The last time South Africa had a vice president or a deputy president who was a woman was Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka under Thabo Mbeki. That's a long time ago. Every single vice president after that has been a man. So there's something around, we can rely on the legislative framework, we can rely on the constitutional values. Can the Commission on Gender Equality do anything more other than make recommendations? You know, are you going to hold a political party? How do you hold them accountable for not having 50-50? It has to come from within, is the point I'm making. And I'm not sure, and there's just so much the policy framework can do to encourage that. So I don't have any answers. It feels like it's a cultural shift that needs to happen. So, traditionally, we're all very conservative, patriarchal societies. Just to go back, one last point. I know I'm all over the show, but Namibia has amazing young women politicians that I met last year before the elections, on all sides, in all political parties, but they are being blocked by the political historical framework, which says that the comrades who've struggled against apartheid in Namibia, they must get first preference. So how do you make sure that that new talent comes through? Is, I think, the big question, and it comes back to this question around political will. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gali, for your insights. I think, yeah, we would, as you said, we would not have the answers, but mostly we are looking at patriarchal societies that we have to deal with. So once again, allow me to thank the speakers. Thank you, Emmanuela. Thank you, Lucas. Thank you, Juliana, for your insights. Allow me to hand this back over to Ben.
Yes, thank you very much, Zipporah, for the wonderful moderation. And then thank you very much to our speakers who have done justice to the topic, the very insightful discussion and views that you have all shared. And then thank you very much to all participants, you who made the time to join the discussion. I'm sure you have taken something from this webinar. For me, I am actually going away with a question which one of the speakers posed, I think Juliana. So in this time of donor reactions and donor cuts and all the happenings within the donor landscape, how does this also reflect on the things that we hope to implement, the activities, the actions, and the policies that we intend to take, which some of these are actually supported by donor funds? I think it's a question that all of us would have to ponder over. And then hopefully in our next session, we'll see how we can interrogate some of these issues on donor and funding and all of that. Thank you very much. We'll be having our next webinar also in the weeks coming, and when it's time, we would do well to inform you about it. Thank you all very much.